Scarcity is a problem in Singapore. You have instances where people apply for flats. Have you seen the queues for people wanting to buy flats? They stretch and they snake around the block. And even assuming you get to put in your application, you have to wait at least 2 years before you're even given a flat. And it's quite simple, right? Logic tells you that. We have close to like 6 million people in Singapore, and we have about roughly 600 square kilometers worth of land space. Generally, after some time, no matter how high your buildings are, it is going to be quite problematic to house everybody in a society. And we think, recognizing the scarcity and the context of Singapore, that the state has to make certain decisions on how best to allocate these resources. And that's where we stand. That's why we think that the state has every right to privilege marriage couples. And it was quite telling as well, that from side proposition, the only time the word marriage came up was in the last 20 seconds of her speech. I'm going to pick up on that later in the rebuttals, right? So what I want to talk to you about today, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, we're going to talk about why marriage is a social good and why our policy will encourage this. Secondly, we're going to talk about why it's justified for the state to use HDBs to privilege married couples, and we have time, a small point about the importance of keeping them in these units. We talk about first, before that, right, some rebuttals. The first rebuttal that we have, they talk about the young people and how young people need to be given some space out there in Singapore and why that's good. We have a couple of responses to that. Firstly, recognizing how the young people are increasingly and upwardly economically mobile, they can afford to rent places as well, and we see the wisdom behind it. The simple fact that being single, right, and being so economically prosperous, we think that mobility where you live is something that they do take to be something important, right? If they work in Tuas, for example, then they might as well just rent some place in Tuas. We recognize the intrinsic benefit that renting provides for these singles. Moreover, and the second response that I have, even if we agree there's some merit and some value to making sure that these people own their own houses, we think recognizing the problem of scarcity that afflicts Singapore, we need to weigh that against the other concerns that we have, right? The overriding social concerns regarding marriage, regarding trying to encourage people to marriage, and why marriage is a social good, something I'll further elucidate later. Then move on to the next idea, right? Know how you can't force people to encourage filial piety. We have a couple of responses to that. The first response that we have is that we always do that anyway, right? Let's look at what she's trying to do. She's trying to inculcate diversity by adding the elderly with the young. That's precisely social engineering at its best. Similarly, what we're trying to do is socially engineer and try to inculcate a sense of filial piety. We've constantly done that. We think it's a common state prerogative, and we're fine with that. Secondly, we think it's especially good because society is predicated on communitarian values that sets the premise for every elected governmental function in Singapore, stemming from the shared values white paper that tells us and it that cultivates this sense of communitarian values in Singaporean society, and we think that's especially good. And the third idea, right? Let's look at which would strain the relations even more. When you get to interact with your parents every day, or when you get to jump ship at the very first moment you possibly can and move to the other side of the island, we think their policy further encourages people to not like their parents, to not even see their parents even on the weekend, something that my brother does, and quite disappointing, but that's another story. Right? Like the whole concept of women's rights. They say, you know what, this is an assault upon women's rights. We think that's false, right? Singapore subscribes to CEDAW's regulations and standards as well. Now, understandably, we don't submit to an international overview of such rights, but we think that the adjudication of women's rights is still quite healthy, and we just need to subordinate to greater social concerns. But let's go to my points of substantive, right? The first point, why marriage is a social good. And I have three reasons for this, two reasons for this. The first reason that we have is that it induces some level of stability for two individuals. Like we understand, this whole concept of love, people getting to know each other, falling in love. But here's the thing, right? It's rather transient and rather tenuous. At the first sign of trouble, if there's no contract binding two individuals together, what do? They split. We think that when you encourage a contract to be built between two individuals and you force them to invest further interest into that contract, it discourages people from even thinking of splitting and ensures stability. And why is this important? Let's look at the Detroits of ghetto and the ghetto of Detroit, the ghettos of Detroit, right? Where the incidence of divorces are at all-time high. Rates for literacy for children are low and incidences for crime are extremely high in these areas. Moreover, let's take somewhere that's comparable, right, in terms of economic status to these areas, like in New Jersey even. We think the rates of divorce as it increases, we can see a corresponding decrease in literacy rates and in the face of these children, and we think that's especially important. Well, thank you, sir. Move on to the second idea, right? We think that it's important to inculcate this sense of family because we need a support system for these individuals. Something that's especially important considering that we are a country that that has no overriding social support system, right? Like that characterizes the countries that do have an HDB policy, like Singapore and like Hong Kong. Recognizing that, we think that the family unit provides the kind of social support system for these individuals in lieu of the overriding scheme. And why is this important? We think that it's important for this support system to be created in the first place, so that whenever you find yourselves in times of trouble, that sounds like a Beatles song, like whenever you find yourselves in times of trouble, you can always rely upon your family members to get you through the particular situation. Sure.
But we're not against married couples having ownership of HDB flats, so why are you wasting our time?
No, scarcity, not enough flats, you don't prioritize them, and you allow people who are particularly rich to snap up these places, you're not going to have the same social effect on these people. That's the concern, right? Move on to the second idea. Why we're justified to use the HDBs to privilege them? Firstly, and quite starkly, in Singapore, we don't have the right to property, right? Like it's understandable. With limited space, land cannot be a trump. It has to be subordinate to status interests. And why is this important? Like, we think that recognizing the scarcity, we at least, at the very minimum, afford things like, for example, the right to shelter to these individuals, thus providing the options for these people. Like, for example, being able to rent flats or to buy those one-room flats that you find in older HDB estate blocks. But as far as it goes, we think with the resources that we have to work with, we need to prioritize it. On the second idea, we think that the state subsidizes this concept of HDB and has primarily used it as a social tool, right? That's why we make sure that foreigners are integrated into the HDB system by according a certain percentage for foreigners. That's why we ensure percentage, like quotas for like racial groups in a particular HDB block as well. Recognizing that the HDB has constantly been used as a social tool and to achieve certain social ends, we think it should be applied and can be applied in the same fashion as well. And on the third idea, we think the state has no obligations to accord you or to afford you certain a segment of state resources just to help you actualize your conception of the good life. We understand that maybe that might be good, right? In an event where we have like unlimited resources. But in the event where the resources are scarce, we think the choice has to be made and the state has every obligation not to provide you to actualize the conception that you have of yourself. Because ladies and gentlemen, we recognize the problem of scarcity and the corollary obligations that the state has in allocating the resources as we need them to be. We stand in sign opposition. We're proud to oppose. Yeah.